I'm going to keep this introduction short because you all know who my guest is. I'm joined by Mick Lynch, General Secretary of the RMT, and we start by talking about the general election. But he was kind enough to let me really take the piss with runtime. And what we really end up talking about is what it means to build class power in the UK. And no matter where you stand politically, he's got a searing take on how politics affects working people, and that deserves your attention. I hope you enjoy the video. Mick Lynch, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Considering you just told me that I've got an inner darkness, I think I'm doing quite well. So onto politics. Back in February, you said that getting rid of the Conservatives is your number one priority, but you're not going to give Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves a blank cheque. What does that mean in practical terms now we're in a general election?
Well, it means that we've got to vote Labour, in my opinion, to get the Tories out. There's only, that's the way the system works in this country. You're not going to get a rainbow coalition or anything. I've just been in Ireland talking about elections over there, and they've got a very complicated transferable vote system, and you end up always with a coalition. We're not going to get that, and there's not going to be a left-wing uprising all of a sudden. We're not going to get a version of a Corbyn party or anything like that coming in. So we've got to get them out. I realise the purges that have been going on and Starmer's stance on many things, including what's going on in the Middle East and lots of other things, wind up a lot of left-wing people, including myself. But sometimes you just got to bite the bullet and say the Tories have got to go. They have to go, because otherwise I don't know what we'll do. And it looks like they will. So that means that we can be secure that Starmer's going to come in. I don't know how that makes everyone feel, especially your listeners and viewers. But it means for the trade union movement and for activists on the left, we have to keep our campaigns going. So whether that's industrial campaigns or political campaigns or campaigns on the streets that we've been seeing, they've got to keep going with all cylinders blasting, so that they don't feel that they can settle down into a comfort zone of managerial politics, democratic politics, I would put it. They've got kind of American. They're not even social democrats as far as I'm concerned. So we've just got to keep going. Any whatever your campaign is, or whatever multitude of campaigns that you're involved in, you've got to keep them going. That's especially with Palestine and Gaza and Israel. But also austerity, housing. Everybody's got their pet campaign, probably a multitude, but housing especially. I was just listening to the radio this morning. They're going to do nothing about housing, it seems to me. There's no campaign for council housing, health service, education. Whatever your bag is, you're going to have to get your posters out and your placards out and get out and demonstrate about them.
It seems to me, though, there's a bit of a tension between saying not going to give them a blank cheque, but also vote Labour wherever you are, because it seems to me that the best outcome would be a smaller Labour majority where the left can apply pressure through independent candidates or Green candidates, rather than such a huge majority that Keir Starmer doesn't have to listen to trade unions or, extra parliamentary movements.
But it's simply not going to happen. Corbyn may get in. I say he's got a 50-50 chance. We're supporting him. We would have supported Diane Abbott if she was independent, and we'll probably support some other independents according to what our branches want. But there's not going to be 50 independents or non-Labour candidates. The SNP will struggle. I think they'll lose seats, and you're just not going to get it. There's a strong chance that the biggest small party could be Reform, which isn't a happy outcome. So there isn't this uprising of people that are going to say, we're going to get over the threshold in first past the post, which is very high. It's probably 15 or 20% to break through. The Liberals will probably get a decent vote, I think. They're having a reasonable campaign on their terms, but I doubt if they'll get more than 50. So Starmer's likely to end up with 100, 120, 150, maybe even 170 as a majority. I think you just got to get used to that. That's what's going to happen. And if you're out campaigning for Tusk or one of these minor parties, you're an irrelevance, really. What we've got to do is concentrate on the ministers that he's going to appoint. So for us, it's the Transport Ministry, but also the Employment Rights, which Angela Rayner's heading up. We're supporting Angela Rayner in her seat. We're going to donate to her campaign and others. And it's up to us to put pressure on these ministers to make sure that we can influence what they do in the first couple of years of this government.
So if I'm reading between the lines, it seems to me that what you're saying is that it's better to exploit factional divisions within the Labour Party, Keir Starmer versus Angela Rayner, competing ministers with different ambitions, rather than try and pour your energy into supporting Green or Independent or Tusk candidates outside the Labour Party.
Well, exploit factional divisions is your term, not mine. So if you take two leading women in the shadow cabinet, Louise Haigh and Angela Rayner, we've got to make sure that on the 5th of July or the 6th of July, when he names that cabinet transfer, that they're in it in important places. And they're not given things like, I'm not saying it's not important, but international development or shadow secretary of the purse or whatever they come up with. I don't know what their titles they've got, Duchy of Lancaster. We've got to make sure that they're holding those good portfolios. And that's up to the trade union movement, I think, to make sure that these promises are delivered. So the New Deal for workers, if Angela Rayner's not in charge of that portfolio, we know we're going to have a problem from day one. From my point of view, and maybe I shouldn't say this, because it may not happen if I say it, but if Louise Haigh is not running transport, we're going to have a real problem. And if we start to get these Mandelsonite clones that just say yes to everything and stick to the idea of the economic policy being the same as the Tories, we're going to have a problem from day one. But we'll also know we're going to have a problem if we don't settle these disputes. So the RMT and ASLEF are going into a new Labour government with live disputes on the railway that have not been settled. And of course, the junior doctors is another high-profile one, not a TUC union, hasn't got an association with Labour, but Labour have got to settle that dispute as quickly as possible and get that thing resolved, which means funding. Now, they're not saying any of that. When they're put under pressure, they don't say how they're going to resolve the doctors' dispute. They think you just get in a room and talk and look at each other for hours on end.
I think the phrase, get round the table.
Yeah, there's got to be funding. The only way you can solve a pay dispute is either by breaking the union and don't give them a pay rise, or come into a settlement. Now, it's up to the parties what that is, but there's got to be money on the table to settle the railway dispute and to settle the doctors' dispute. So we'll get very early indications. It's not up to legislation. It's about who's in the important jobs in the cabinet and what they're going to do about some of these disputes. There's other things they've got to get on with, but even if they wanted to tackle housing, that's going to take a long time. And they're going straight into a recess within a week or two of taking power.
Is there a part of you that looks at the prospect of a Labour government which has a big majority, but perhaps shallow public support and thinks, we've got leverage there?
Well, I hope so, because I think we've won a lot of arguments over the last couple of years about what the nature of work is, how unfair society is. And I think there's a lot of people know that, but they don't see in Keir Starmer a person on a mission. I mean, I know he's put these 5 or 6 missions up, but I can't remember what they are.
I can't remember a single one.
Nobody knows what these missions are. If his missions were public housing, to work for international peace, to resolve the water crisis, or whatever, things that had names on them that people could identify, then I think people would have a bit more faith in him. And I always say it's about your values. If you say, I believe in council housing, not working with developers to resolve the housing crisis, now, people would give you a bit of leeway. You know that you can't start digging up foundations the next morning after you assume power. But the Attlee government did it, and I know people harp on about the Attlee government, but we were in far more financial crisis. The country was completely bankrupt. The railways were absolutely broken. The coal industry was broken at the time, and housing was absolutely dire. People were living in destitution, and we'd been bombed, especially in this area in Bermondsey. It's why there's so many council houses outside your door here. So that can be done if you've got the will, but you can't do it without a new economic and industrial policy. So it was really disappointing that they dropped the Green New Deal or the Green Industrial Revolution. That's the first sign it's going to be diluted. And I don't think a Labour Party's ever come into government with a thinner manifesto. There is nothing that most people could name as being the thing that they're going to do, or the things, apart from they're going to stick to the Tories' fiscal rules, which is a big disappointment. But they can be made more radical. We've got to make sure that they feel the heat of public opinion and activist opinion and all the rest of it.
Analysis from the BBC's Ben Chu shows that the 2024 Labour manifesto, not only does it have much smaller tax and spend commitments than 2019, 2017, it's also got smaller tax and spend commitments than previous Tory manifestos and the current Lib Dem ones. People disparagingly call the Labour leadership red Tories, but aren't they right?
No, I don't think they're red Tories. I think any Labour government will be better than the best Tory government. So, I'm a bit tribal. I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but we are a Labour movement. So what you've got to remember is this country is in a descent. It's in a spiral of decline. And the Tories have done that to us. I think it's 44 years of Thatcherism. We're suffering from mature Thatcherism now that the Blair era did not do anything about. In fact, it probably piled it on a bit more with the PPP and the Private Finance Initiative and continued privatisation. So we've got to stop the decline. If they do the straightforward things on the New Deal for Workers, if they repeal some of the anti-trade union laws and give the unions an ability to fight in the workplace and organise properly, then we'll see some turnaround. We can do things about declining wages ourselves as trade unions, but we've got to be given the legislative room in order to do that. So it's not quite as dire as people think. And my experience is everyone wants taxation, right? This sounds a bit Tory.
Go on then.
Everybody on the left and everybody in the public thinks there should be more public expenditure and more taxation in order to pay for better services. And that's shown in opinion polls. But it's not shown at the ballot box. People do not historically vote for increased taxation if it's put that way. And you've seen how careful they've been about that issue. Now, I don't think that's right. I think Rachel Reeves should have an alternative economic strategy. She's got a really boring outlook to what's going to go on with the economy. I can't see the economy turning a particular corner. They're hoping for a tailwind, probably from the American economy somehow, and they're hoping that the private sector will somehow put some momentum, to use that word, into the economy in the next few years. Now, maybe that will happen and they'll get some benefits from that because there will be a higher tax take. There will be an ability to put more funds into various services. But if it doesn't happen, they're going to have a real problem, and which has beset Labour administrations in the past. But I don't think people are going to vote for tax in this country. That's just the way it is. I think we have to start a campaign about tax, that tax is good, that it's a form of redistribution of wealth. But we are miles and miles away on the left from winning that argument. It's been won in Scandinavia, been won in certain parts of Europe, that paying your tax is a good thing and that the consequences you get from that of a better society are good things. But we're a long way from winning that, and Thatcher has won that argument, and her best legacy, for her point of view, is to make the Labour Party in her image in that sense. And that's where we are, and that's what we've got to turn around. But it's no good just shouting from the side, let's have more tax. If you do that, you're likely to not win the election. That's the way I see it.
I mean, Margaret Thatcher famously said, economics is the method, the object is to change the soul. Do you think that Thatcherism has made us worse people?
Well, I think the two things, I do. I do think we are worse people. I think society's worse. I think innately in people they've got the ability to be good, but it's the economic structure on which society sits. So when the economics of the world told us that the reason you're poor is because you're bad, people went along with it. And it took a long time to change that dynamic. And that was what socialism did in all its forms, was to say that you can change the world through your own power, through solidarity. But her achievement is she's broken that. She's broken the idea of solidarity. She's broken the idea in many ways of class consciousness, economically and politically. She hasn't broken it societally, or whatever you want to call that, culturally. Many people still do identify themselves as working class, but they don't identify themselves as socialists or even as progressive in any way. So we've got to win that argument back. It's a big battle. I fear, though, that the left has got a habit of lecturing people, trying to sell them really boring newspapers at all events, chanting, and
sometimes there's boring podcasts as well.
There are some boring podcasts, and there's some good ones, and we'll see how that develops. But when I see left activists trying to engage with working class people, it's extremely tedious. All this stuff about Lenin and Stalin and Mao, it's dead. And the left has got to get used to it. It's not coming back. The idea of a vanguard group is the most elitist, patronising thing that the working class has ever had to deal with. So what we need, I believe, is robust and determined social democracy, which is rescued from the right wing in this country and is turned into a real left-wing dynamic. It's going to achieve change in working class communities and is going to leave a legacy that it can't be wiped out by right-wing ideas, which is what we're in danger of, I think.
Do you think that the left suffers from at once being too middle class and also very guilty about the fact that it's so middle class and therefore finds it impossible to connect with working class people on a level that's easy and authentic?
I don't know about guilt. I don't know. I was brought up a Catholic. I left guilt behind, I think. So I don't know. I'm not middle class. I've got a good income, but you know.
Nah, but you're part of the left. Do you observe the politics of the left?
I think it's a slightly lecturing, slightly patronising, slightly vicary approach, if that makes any sense. If you want the left to be an element of the working class, it's got to be in the working class. But we've got to do a lot with education. We've got to teach people what an alternative world would be like and what a progressive world, where a society is getting better. Most people think society is getting worse, and that's the left and the right. So if you look at right-wing stuff, they're obsessed with the idea that they're under siege, that the society is going to hell in a handcart and all that kind of business. And many people who should be on the left, people that are poorer, don't see the left as an alternative. They don't see that it belongs to them. So I don't know whether it's guilt or it's because they've separated themselves. But I do know that many people who thought they weren't working class are becoming working class. If you look at what the barristers and the doctors, they've had to use traditional working class methods, traditional working class organisation to get where they want to go. But people in the media, people in the arts, people in journalism, I think there is a real separation between them and working class estates, working class communities. So, but there is from me as well. I mean, I don't live in Bradford, I don't live in Barnsley, I don't live in the East End of Glasgow. You can only be in one place at a time. But what I do know, as we go around as a trade union, we have a really effective organisation that's national, and we've got to build the trade unions, I think, is the answer to re-engaging with working class people. And the idea that political struggle is separated from trade union struggle has got to end. And there's a whole strata of people in the Labour Party who don't regard themselves as part of a trade union movement. It used to be compulsory. You weren't allowed to be in the Labour Party unless you were a trade unionist. I think that's changed. So you get a separation that's slightly 2-1 and 2-2 degree level, and that's the people that are consisting of the Labour Party. But there aren't any bricklayers or plumbers or electricians. That's the problem.
I want to talk about class identity and class consciousness for a second, because sure, I might say, well, I'm working class because I have to sell my labour in order to live. I can't live off of asset wealth. I'm not part of the ownership class. But if I pop up with my accent and my educational background and go, oh, I'm working class, people will laugh me out of the room. So isn't there a problem that you might have quite a broad number of people who are completely cut out from property ownership and asset ownership, but culturally there is a completely separate existence, completely different way of being, completely different way of talking, completely different habits that make the idea of saying, well, we're all working class feel a bit misleading.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think the problem is that if you go to a meeting, let's say you go to a generation rent meeting or something like that, it's likely that the people you meet there will all have your accent and all have your background and are all struggling to pay their rent. That's why they're there. But they don't think I'm really disappointed by some of these housing movements. They don't actually join in the campaign for council housing. So I grew up on a council estate in central London, in Paddington, and when I grew up there, it was full of employment. Everyone on that estate had 1 or 2 jobs. There were all sorts of people living there. There were artistic people, there were taxi drivers, there were people who had trades. There weren't doctors and solicitors, but there were people from every aspect of working class life. Now, if you become a successful tradesperson, tradesman in old money, you're likely to move out and live a separate life to the rest of the working class. Whereas in those days, you were probably likely to be leading working class communities. You'd be active in the Tenants Association, active in the Labour Party, active in the social club. And I see middle-class people, or what are called middle-class people, saying, oh, let's form a trendy bingo club, or let's have a trendy bowls night in Finsbury and all this. And it's almost as if you're laughing, not you, but it's almost as if they're laughing at working class culture and how quaint it is, rather than actually joining a working men's club and trying to help with run the committee and make it more relevant to today, because they're all ageing, these places. I think that's the separation, that somehow that working class culture is different from an educated culture, if you could put it that way, that if you've been to university, you can only live with people who've been to university as well. So when you're getting flat shares and all that, people don't say, well, I think I'll get a flat share with somebody who's working on the A1, re-tarmacking it. They say I'll get a flat share with somebody that's done sociology or media studies or whatever. And that's, I don't know how that is. Whereas if you had proper, vibrant council housing, all of these people would be eligible. But the fact that the only people who are eligible for council housing now, because it's in such short supply, are people who have got desperate need, if I can put it that way. And that's a problem in working class communities as well, because the children, this is an old sore in working class communities, the children of working class people cannot then get council housing and they have to move elsewhere. So the communities become splintered and fractured. So I think one of the key demands of the working class and of the labour movement should be council housing that's open to all, with mixed communities that then try to remodel the cities and the towns and villages. And it's really important that we've got to go, it's not just inner city London, it's not inner city Manchester. There's desperate poverty and desperate housing need in so many working class communities in small towns and villages and even rural economies. And people forget there used to be council housing even in the rural areas. You'll see rows of terraced houses outside villages all over the country. And that needs to be what we go back to. And things like that, I think, will revive working class culture and make it more holistic, because it's definitely fractured between the people that have third level education and people that don't, and it's got to be addressed.
I guess I want to talk about that sense of decline and how it relates to housing. So I live in Tottenham, and there's like 2 streets between my street and the main road, and there's a little shortcut. And now every time I take that shortcut, there is a group of people who are like in the middle of the day taking heroin on the street, and they live in basically these like housing association flats, which kind of exist between the main road and the gentrifying bit, the desirable bit. And what that looks like to me is that there is this block of flats which is just completely and utterly abandoned, right? So you've got people living there who've all got very high need, many of whom have got physical health issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues. And then there are families who've managed to get on the housing association list because, you know, it's a single mom with kids.
But nobody should be on a housing association list. The housing associations in this country have become completely corrupted by developers and by the way that the Tories funded them. They should be on council house lists, and there should be council amenities servicing those people. When I was a kid on my estate, there were children's homes and there were old people's homes as part of the fabric of the estate. So that's why I say that there were all sorts of people there. So there were people who were fostered and orphaned living in council houses with council carers. Now, not many people want people with drug abuse problems living next door to them. But what you need to move that on is properly funded care, as you say, and you need good policing, if I'm frank with you. That's what many working class people want on working class estates. They want community policing that's really effective, that deals with drug dealers. There's not many people like to hear that.
What does good policing mean to you?
It means good policing is part of the community. It's from the community. It's part of the community, and they know exactly what's needed, rather than tearing around in patrol cars, going to the most dangerous thing. Now, that's not the police's fault, and it's not very left to say this, but we do need community police that's looking after the interests of working class people. And if that means they have to deal with other working class people who are ruining working class communities, that's what working class people want. And so you have people that can look after people in need through social workers and drug counsellors and all the rest of it. But you have complete council provisions. And one of the scandals in this country is the way that councils have been gutted. They've been completely defunded. Everyone talks about defunding services on the left. Well, it's happened in front of your eyes, and the deterioration of our communities is because of that defunding. Whereas in previous times, even Tory and Liberal administrations in government, like Chamberlain in Birmingham and all sorts of people that were reformers, had a real mission to change their communities entirely, and they did it. They did it up until Thatcher, and then that has been, and there were all sorts of people. They weren't just Labour, but they were driven by Labour politics because the consensus was we have to reform and change this society. We have to abolish poverty and rickets and malnutrition and outside toilets and put baths in people's houses. Massive ambitions,
and they
I
did
know.
It. And they did
and
it.
They did it. And they did it because a consensus grew up from the Labour movement that it had to change. And while that was going on, we had the Factories Acts and Health and Safety at Work Acts and all sorts of stuff that changed the workplace. Because working class people or communities used to be full of people who'd been maimed at work or widowed or orphaned because of the world of work. We did all that stuff. And so working class people and other people need to know our history, that it's the great reforms in our society that have changed and improved our lives, not the revolutions, mostly.
I mean, I want to go back to the policing thing. It seems to me that you've got a lack of patience with the call to defund the police.
Absolutely.
And what about people who say, well, investment in police criminalises working class communities disproportionately?
The problem isn't the investment. The problem is what the police are. So you're going to have a police, you're going to have an army. I don't know if people on the left realise this. You are going to have a navy and an army and an air force and the ability to defend the country. These are demands of the working class, by the way, not just of the Daily Telegraph. So you're going to have a police. What you've got to make the police is accountable to the people that they serve, not accountable to property and ownership and the ruling class in this country. So it would be handy if we swore an oath of an allegiance to the community rather than the state to protect and serve, as they say in America, and that the policing was properly funded but based on our communities and the community's needs. So rather than spending their time standing on picket lines, as they have done in the past, defending the right of property and the right of owners, maybe they should just make sure that pickets can protest peacefully, but also make sure that the estates that are around the corner are being properly protected. So I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe that's a working class agenda. Working class people want properly secure communities that are fully funded with good housing, good amenities and good jobs. So that means funding them properly, but giving them a different remit.
And so what about if someone was to say, well, look, you know, everyone wants more community policing. Everyone wants more visible policing. Everyone wants policing which deals with behaviour that makes working class communities feel genuinely unsafe. But what that translates to is stop and search, right? Or even suspicionless searches and breaking down a sense of trust between, you know, black and brown working class boys, mostly, and the police themselves, because all they experience is harassment and being targeted.
Well, that's what I say. You've got to change who the police are. You've got to change what they're responsible for. But if you want to drive out social ills, you've got to start with where the social ills come from, which is the system. The system we're involved in will create and generate people who are alienated from their community and from their society. So we've got to make good people. We've got to make good communities, and that starts at the bottom. So that's why it's a long-term project. And people like Attlee and people like Bevan knew that. So the NHS wasn't perfect when it was created. It got better and better, and now it's getting worse. So you need to coach society. You need to educate it. You need to train it. You need to give people hope. But that doesn't mean that the answer to problems with the police is to not have a police force. I mean, there would be some people who would be delighted to not have a police force, and they would be the people that are ruining our working class community. So I think that's a bit of a nonsense. If we've got a programme that is going to change society for the better, it's got to be a whole programme. So it's got to be about education, it's got to be about attainment, it's got about people feeling that they are part of the society. And it's also got to include ending criminalisation, that communities are criminalised, but we've got to stop the creation of criminals. And we do that by having a better society. So any of this, defunding the police or just funding the police in a different way, is just a sticking plaster, because unless you change working class communities and therefore working class culture and get everyone into a well-paying job, you're always going to have criminality, I'm afraid. There's always been criminality while I've been alive. Under the Wilson government, under the Callaghan government, under the Blair government, there was criminality and there were a lot of societal ills. But it's a question of whether we're declining or whether we're getting better. What we've got to do at the minute is end the spiral of decline, which is what Thatcherism has done to us, and turn that into a society where we're improving it in all aspects. And that's got to start in the nursery, even in the delivery room, if you like, if you want to paint that analogy, because maternity services are even declining, hospitals are closing. You've got to start right from the beginning, but you've got to educate working class people before they've had children. What do they want to achieve in their lives? And the whole thing. People have realised that for a long time, but often those people are now denigrated. The people that wanted to push wholesale social reform are told, well, you're just a reformer. Well, I think being a reformer is a great thing because they're not ideologically pure. But the ideologically pure tend to just leave us with a mound of recycled paper, in my experience. And maybe they don't even recycle it. And they don't achieve anything. And you end up with this burnt out trot, cynical level of people on the left of politics who say nothing's going to change, or even go to the extreme right, which we've seen examples of, and there's some of them in the House of Lords now.
My grandma used to call it left-wing intellectual masturbation.
Yeah.
She had very little patience with it. I want to talk about council housing, because that's been a really big theme of what you've been discussing. In the Labour manifesto, there's an awful lot about first-time buyers. It's all about getting onto the housing ladder. And I'm absolutely not going to criticise people wanting the security of owning your own home in a context where the private rental sector is dominated by insecurity. But do you think that overall there's too much emphasis on owning your own home, and actually we should be a lot more comfortable with secure council tenancies?
Well, I need to be clear that I own my own home and all my family own their own homes, and we all came from a council flat. So that's the change you get. And it's an aspiration of many working class people to own their own homes, or at least to have a secure tenancy, as you say. But there's no prospect of having a secure council tenancy because there's less council houses every year. So, and there is too much private rented accommodation, and there is too much encouragement of landlordism. So the idea that one of your ambitions as a middle class person is to own one or more other properties than the one you live in, which is fine, I've got no problem with that, and then rent them to other working class or other middle class people as it is now, and make a profit from that is a fairly dubious moral. And when I was a kid, the area I grew up in, we had Rachmanism, terrorist landlords, and being called a landlord in working class communities was a mark of sin, really. People hated landlordism. From the society I grew, my culture, the Irish culture, landlord, the word landlord was not a nice word. Now, the RMT is a landlord. We own properties, funnily enough. We rent to people and they give us an income. So there is a place for private sector, especially in short-term tenancies and people who want a bit of fluidity in their lives. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're coming from another town or from another country, you want to get set up in London or wherever, there's no problem with the short-term private rented sector. But we need a massive council house programme. And that could mean not just building new houses, but taking private tenancies into public ownership. There was an awful lot of that in the 50s and 60s. They took properties off private landlords, often where they were completely degrading the properties, which is happening now, and turn them into tenable and reputable housing for working class people. So I think the answer is a massive council sector, probably 30 or 40%, and then maybe 30 or 40% for private ownership with no restriction on that. But the market would sort that out. And then there would be a private sector in the middle where people who needed that fluidity or preferred it could exist. But the problem is there's not a private sector, a public sector. The housing associations have sold their soul entirely. And this idea of affordable housing, as it's called, and social housing is one of the biggest deceptions in modern Britain.
Why is it a deception?
Because it doesn't exist. And if you get it, the standards of housing are appalling. Most people now who take these part ownership deals where you get a quarter of the rent of or a quarter of the ownership of a flat that's £600,000 in West London where I live, and your kitchen will be in your sitting room is a nonsense. So it's a studio flat with a bedroom attached. You should never be building properties like that. So we've not only degraded the tenure and the ownership of housing, we've degraded the architectural and engineering standards of housing. And if you've got one of these properties, after 3 years, with the cladding issues that are now existing, many of them, you think, why am I living in this little hutch? And I've paid millions of pounds over the period of my lifetime. If I ever want to own it, I'm going to have to pay probably, because it goes up by the market value, probably up to £1 million to get a 2-bedroom flat in London. This is a deception, and it's a great fraud on our people. When they used to build council properties, I think it would repay itself within 50 or 60 years through the rent. Now, that's not a bad thing. And you could even have some kind of stake in that if you wish, but run by the council. And going back in the day, the council used to give working class people direct mortgages, which used to raise revenue for council income. So there is an alternative way to do it. And what we don't hear about at the minute is any alternative, because the media, including the BBC and most channels, talk about the aspiration of private ownership and the idea that a housing association, which is basically the arm of a property developer now, and the chief execs are on 450 grand a year or more, are going to save working people or generation rent, is a nonsense. They're only going to be helped by massive council ownership of properties.
I've got a provocation for you, and it's about this question of landlordism. And it's actually something that my husband said to me. So my husband was the first in his family to go to uni, grew up near Barnsley, moved down to London, got himself a nice middle-class wife and living the dream. He and all his friends are very, very against landlordism. And it's because many of them have been defined by being part of Generation Rent. Yeah. So moving to London, living in really shitty house shares, being, exploited and squeezed at every turn, landlords that don't fix stuff, unreasonable rent increases, you name it.
Yeah, most house shares haven't got Ross and the Friends cast living in them, have they?
No Ross, no Rachel, no Chandler, no nothing. Meanwhile, his brother stayed up north, didn't go to uni, works in a factory near Huddersfield. I was chatting to my husband and he said, well, all of my culturally very middle-class friends in London are very, very against landlordism. My brother, I can see him one day wanting to own a second property to rent out locally.
Homes under the hammer.
Because that's going to be his pension. That's going to be his security in old age. And what my husband said to me that was quite challenging was that actually a lot of this very, very hardcore anti-landlord stance is a lot more prevalent amongst middle-class people, whereas working-class people see it as a way out of precarity.
Well, you'd have to be a particular stratum of the working class to say, I'm going to buy properties and rent them out. So most people can't do that. But there is room for private sector, but it's got to be regulated and it should give you a reasonable income without being exploitative. And that's the way it is in many European countries and even in America under controlled tenancy. So you could easily get a 5 or 6 or 7% income off a property, which isn't that exploitative, but it's got to be regulated. And tenancies were regulated in Britain and they changed all that. And you'd probably be far better off being under the tenancy of a regulated company rather than a private individual landlord, I'm sorry to say. But what your brother-in-law's predicament is, he probably hasn't got a pension, even though he has a reasonable job. He's got one of these poxy privately invested pensions, what's now called a defined contribution scheme. On the railway, one of the things we've been fighting for is the preservation of a final salary defined benefit pension scheme, which is really, really good. Now, masses of people used to have those in Britain, and now only 8% of private sector workers have a defined benefit scheme. That gives you a guaranteed income, the longer you're in it, the better it is, and a big lump sum at retirement. That's been stripped away and been turned into company profit because they don't have to pay for these pensions. So all of the big employers, including the private sector ones, whoever you want to name, Ford, BP, ICI, Marks and Spencer's, Tesco's, whatever you want, all used to have final salary pension schemes. And there would be no need for their staff to be looking at landlordism and taking that risk. What they've done through the pension scheme is put the risk on you, so that when you come to the point of retirement, depending where the stock market is what you get for your income, and it will always be worse than the schemes we used to have. So I don't want to be one of these people that's just looking backwards all the time, but you never know what you've got till it's gone, and you don't know what you should have until you know what people used to have. So we've got a remarkable society that's not progressing. The ambition of most politicians, and whatever their political colour is, they like to say, well, the society's done better despite all the issues we had during my period. It's done better in my period than when we took power. Working class people have been stripped of many of the gains that they made, even from the end of the First World War going forward, where we first got state provision of benefits and then enhanced by the Attlee government and the Macmillan government and others, to be fair. That was a consensus that stood the test of time. So wherever you look, housing, income, pension, all these things are related, and you've got to recast what politics are. And going back to what Labour has done, this has been their opportunity to restate what Britain could be like. That's just internally to what our community's like. They could have taken the chance to deal with international relations as well, because there's an opportunity on that. And they failed to live up to that. That's why we've got a campaign and bring all these individual campaigns together, whether it's housing, education. Nobody's mentioning tuition fees in this election. Everyone was mentioning them 8 or 9 years ago, but nobody's going to do anything about that. I don't even know if a Corbyn-led government would have been able to take that on at this time. But you've got to discuss them, and many things have been dropped from the discussion, and all we're talking about is managerialism over what we've got. So we've got to get our eyes on the prize, really. When they formed the Labour Party and when they formed the unions, everybody said the next 2 years are really terrible for us, and how are we going to achieve anything? How are we going to get better wages for our members? And people at the back of the room were saying, well, we don't just need better wages, we need sanitation. Things like that were brought in through really strong reform. We were all dying of TB. And the reformers changed society and made us all healthier, taller, stronger, and longer living.
They made some of us taller. They did not make me taller.
Well, you could have been even smaller if it wasn't for the Victorian reformers.
Well, let's talk about the railways for a second, because one of the things which is just not mentioned in the manifesto is high-speed rail. And I look at countries like China, not a perfect society, I'm not romanticising it, but they've got an awful lot of high-speed rail. Is there a part of you which feels envious of the ability of other countries to just build the infrastructure?
Well, you don't need to look to China, you look to Spain. They've just completely constructed a high-speed rail network. We're in a period where they've had some economic and political problems themselves. They've got a complete high-speed rail network that is connected up to the French high-speed rail network, and that one's connected to the German one. So they've got an intercontinental high-speed rail network through state railways, largely, which are now being dismembered by the EU, by the way, liberalisation. So it can be done. This is a much more crowded island, to be fair. So I do agree with Starmer, you have got to be quite forceful. So when we built HS1, which has been forgotten, the one that you can take to your lovely weekend trips to the continent, which I used to work on for 25 years, that was a disaster. It took ages to build it. It took ages to build the tunnel. It lost money. The high-speed one through Kent took ages. We had to go around all the middle-class areas to stop people, gardens being affected. And we built it for £7.5 billion and sold it for £900 million. So that's the type of businessman that George Osborne was, and that's now in private hands. So you've got to decide what you want to do in a society. I said this to somebody the other day. What are your priorities on health? What are your priorities on elders' care? What are your priorities on education, on transport? And then you've got to say, how are we going to fund it? You would have thought that ministers, so the Minister of Education, you thought they'd have to come to the dispatch box and give reports on their long-term ambitions. You would have thought that climate would be a 25-year plan and that there'd be a consensus around it. You'd think that transport, because transport doesn't go away, the railways we've got now were commenced in the 1830s and they're still with us. That's one of our problems. You would have thought that the Transport Minister would go, this is my ambition on rail, my ambition on bus, my ambition on aviation, and part of that is my contribution to climate. and I'm going to report on that every 6 months. And that's what they do in some other parliaments. We do it where everyone just screams at each other about the pork barrel, the immediate thing in their area. My honourable friend, is it true that Weybridge Council has got more buses than blah, 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 and all that nonsense? Whereas what we should actually be doing is having a national plan, which does sound a bit like the Chinese state, I suppose. But every society should have a national plan and all these things. And you'd be saying the same about housing. Whereas we've got all these people bickering about what the developers are going to do for us, rather than directing what building companies should be doing for us, which is one of the ways of achieving these things. So it's a disaster. Infrastructure in this country is an utter disaster. And you look at the schools with the concrete crisis and the hospitals, you may get your appointment in the clinic, but it may fall on your head while you're in there. Because we can't build anything anymore. We've lost the ability to...
Well, that would solve your health problem, right?
Yeah,
exactly. You're not going to be worried by endometriosis anymore if the ceiling falls on your head. So
we've lost the ability to be the constructors and the engineers and the civil engineers, for better or worse, for imperialism, showing people how to get these things done, which is where Britain was. And I'm not harking back to that. But it does show that people with determination and a large army can usually get things done in society, which is what the Chinese state has done, I suppose. But there's got to be a way where a modern economy can build things that you could be proud of. And if you look at our inner city, most of it we're not very proud of. But that's been a disease since the 60s, when we built some monstrosities and imposed them on working class communities, such as the one I lived in, where we got a great big motorway 40 foot above our heads.
And what they did to Bradford city centre.
Well, they were going to build a whole elevated network in London, and it was stopped because of funding cuts, which is one of the better... But if you look at the Westway, and many artists lament and sing its praises, the Westway, including The Clash, one of my favourite bands, but that was put right above my head and knocked all our working class housing down from Hammersmith through to Marylebone. It's an eyesore. It's horrible. So we've got to have a better infrastructure, and we've got to have people who've got the ambition to do it. Starmer's saying he's going to do that, but what I think we'll end up with is a load of tower blocks built by developers, populated by people living in hutches, paying exorbitant rents and mixtures of rent and mortgage.
What are the examples of council housing that you've seen in this country or internationally that you think that's beautiful, quality, decent housing?
Well, it's not all beautiful. Some of it is fairly utilitarian. But the one I grew up on, the Warwick Estate in Paddington, between Royal Oak and Warwick Avenue Tubes, if you're ever walking through, has got low-level stuff. It's got high-level stuff. It's built by the GLC and Westminster Council in the mid-60s. What they did there was plant. And you've got trees that are now mature 60-year-old trees. It's still got the old church buildings on it. So they did adapt to the environment they're in. It's really green. I don't live there anymore, but I lived there all my childhood. And some of that is really nice. But I think one of the challenges would be to get a whole breed of young architects and give them the challenge of remodelling our urban environment. And I think that would be really exciting. I think there'd be loads of people willing to take that on through a different funding model. Because basically what they build now is built on a computer by structural engineers. It's a load of steel put up. If you watch them go up, they go up in rapid time. There's steel boxes created, and then they insert pods. So you can live in what's not much more than a trailer, but on an elevated view. And then they'll invite you to pay $4,500 a year service charge for the lifts, on top of your rent and on top of your mortgage and on top of your council tax. People are being hyper-exploited through housing. And the challenge would be to change our societies and our communities. And there should be a model for it. They should be looking for the pension schemes to get bonds where they get guaranteed return. They should be looking to give that money to exciting council projects, which I think could be a great future for us.
I want to move back to the election for a second. So Nigel Farage is trying to brand this the immigration election, and Reform do seem to be appealing to voters in areas which have experienced high levels of deprivation. From your perspective, what's their appeal, and how can the left keep up with right-wing populists?
Well, through things like I've just been saying, that we're going to remodel and reshape your town so it's going to be better, so it can deal with everyone there. We've got
you
to
can
stand
only
up.
do that with power, right?
You can. So if you let the Tories back in, that's what's going to happen. So it's the wielding of power that's important once you get it. So what I tell people is you cannot deny that immigration is an issue. So I've just been in Ireland. I go to Ireland a lot. for various reasons. And what you've got in Irish towns and villages is the imposition on people of lots of people who haven't got a home. So if you go to a rural West of Ireland town that's only got 600 people in it, and bring 200 other people, whether they're from Africa or Ukraine or wherever, and say, we're going to house these people or accommodate them, not house them, in your village, there's going to be an issue with it. And you can't avoid that. And you've got to say, well, we're going to bring resources, we're going to bring social workers and all the rest of it that are going to try and deal with this. But what working class communities get is people being brought to their community, the communities that were already struggling, and then they've got to deal with it themselves, because then the next year the council will get more cuts and the councils have got to deal with it. And there aren't any answers. So if you're going to bring people, you need to bring funding that matches that. But it's got to be to the benefit of all the people living there. And it's not just got to be to the benefit of the people that are migrating. The receiving communities have got to benefit as well.
So I'm with you on the need for more resources. I'm certainly with you on the need to end the policy of dispersal that we've got in this country, where asylum seekers have been deliberately placed in areas where they've got no community support, which experience high levels of deprivation. And it's the worst of all worlds for everybody. You've got no support for the asylum seekers, an awful lot of social isolation, and you've also got areas which are struggling for resources themselves. I agree with you there. But one of the things that polling consistently finds is that the areas which are most hostile towards immigration have the least immigration.
Yeah, they've had it the least traditionally. So if you take Boston, Lincolnshire, which is the archetypal reform UKIP town, I suppose, not village, they didn't have migration that we were used to. I mean, my parents were migrants, similar generation to your own and your grandparents probably. And the Irish congregated in areas that are full of Irish people. They also used to be full of people from the West Indies and from South Asia as well. That used to come along with it. And they were often in areas that were affiliated to each other geographically and then politically. So you got an Irish vote in Kilburn and Paddington. You got an Asian vote in Southall and other areas. So even if you do disperse them, people tend to come back to where they can recongregate, and that's what my parents did. So I think there's got to be a middle ground. There's got to be a way where you oppose racism. You have to oppose racism, people that discriminate on the basis of people's background. Most people in this country understand that racism is bad.
But we're not all in agreement about what racism is.
Well, exactly. But most people understand that if you discriminate and hate people because of their colour, there's something wrong with it. Because even racists normally start with, I'm not being racist, but... And I've had to stop people. So when you get to the but, just stop there. Don't go on with the rest of it. But it is difficult to talk about the issues of migration. And there are definite issues about housing, jobs, language, of course, and culture that are difficult to work out. And there's this question between assimilation and people respecting other people's cultures. There's always going to be that dynamic, and it's going to be tense every now and again. But what I would say is most working class communities, and I do realise all of the racism and all of the problems that we've had, and I used to live in a very diverse community, to say the least. I mean, the Notting Hill Carnival came past my mum's front door, and the last council flat I lived in. So we were right in the heart of that in Westbourne Park and Paddington. But the English working class has tolerated, in the main, in the historical realm of going right back to Windrush, despite all the murders, despite all the hatred, the assimilation by the English working class is in some ways admirable. They have intermarried, they've loved, they've had children with many of the people that have came in as their neighbours, even if they started out as people they didn't want as their neighbours. So time is one of the things that we have to have. But to allow time to take care of these issues, you have to fund the communities that are receiving people. And it's no good pretending that you're just going to bring a load of people in from another culture and another society, and it's just get on with it. So we have to make sure that all sorts of societal groups, and a lot of the people that do the heavy lifting are faith groups. I'm not in a faith group anymore, but I have to admire the way that many of those people take up this burden unpaid and unrewarded. So we've got to reach out to those groups and all sorts of people. And formerly, I think, in many working class communities, there would have been people who led the way in tenants' associations and the Labour Party, and they would have all been linked up with the faith groups as well, by the way, which what makes a society. And many people on the left haven't got any time for faith groups, unfortunately, anymore. Even if you're not of faith, you've got to realise that what makes the world go round and work is people from all sorts of angles. I do sound like a vicar now, don't I?
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's one of the things I've learned, because when I was young, I was ideologically opposed to religion and vehemently would argue about it. But now when you see who's left doing the hard graft in many communities, it's the people that are of faith. And not just Christian faith, which is what the traditional thing in working class communities are, but when we were doing Enough is Enough, we were welcomed into cathedrals and mosques and gurdwaras and temples and all sorts of places. And they were actually feeding a lot of white working class people as well. They were running the food banks and actually doing kitchens and all sorts of stuff for the homeless. So that's got to be part of the working class movement, that it's not just a political movement, it's not just an ideas movement, it's actually getting out and doing the work on the ground. And many of us on the left are guilty of not doing that work, including me, by the way.
In what way?
Well, I don't do enough. I don't do enough in my community. I'm exhausted most evenings when I get in. But there's many people from other angles in the community that are out doing that work with the homeless, with drug offenders, with youth in youth centres. Very unpopular. A lot of people take the piss out of youth centres and bingo and lunch clubs and all that. But they are at the heart of what we need to do. If somebody's out taking elderly Irish people, elderly English people, elderly Caribbean people to a lunch club up the road, which is usually in a church hall, that is what keeps that community together. And I know that is still happening.
Well, one of the factors that made serious youth violence in London a lot worse is the closure of youth centres.
Yeah.
It's made it a lot worse. I want to stick with the upcoming general election for now. What do you make of George Galloway?
I think he's got a well-regarded ego. I don't regard them as a serious political movement. We're not the RMT, and I won't give them any support whatsoever. I think there's no space for them in the political spectrum.
Even if he wins again?
I understand what he's feeding on. Well, yeah, but I don't think it's bringing the community together. I think it's quite a dangerous game that he's playing. I want the Labour Party to be as strong and as radical as it can be, even though I'm not a member of it. I don't think we need an ideological group to the left that's serious. I don't think we need this curious populist group that's being all things to all people in Labour territory. I think we need a proper Labour Party that's going to do the job for working class people, which isn't going to be what many people want. And it never would be, of course, because that's the nature of being a party that's trying to be homogenous to the centre and the left of the spectrum. But I don't think there's any need for or any room for the Workers' Party.
If I was a voter in Rochdale and my choice is between Paul Waugh, centrist, former journalist, when he was a journalist, very hostile to Corbyn and the Corbyn movement, and the Workers' Party, would your advice be?
Yeah, but this is one of the things. In the Labour Party, you are, and I support Jeremy, and we're supporting him in his election, but you are allowed to criticise Corbyn and John McDonnell. John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn are friends of mine. But if they're going to criticise the right, you are allowed to criticise Corbyn. And the Labour Party has to be a party where there can be critical debate about policy, implementation and programmes of action. So there's nothing wrong with that. I don't know this bloke.
I'll take your correction. I'll take your correction because I think you're right. Being critical is more than welcome, right? It's necessary for a healthy political culture. But I suppose what I'm talking about is journalists who would pride themselves on being impartial, but handled the left with anything but impartiality and fairness.
There's no impartial journalists. They work for big business. I'm talking about the mainstream media. You can write whatever you want. It's going to get sub-edited unless you've got a particular contract to write whatever. Even that gets sub-edited,
but then you go from doing that job to standing for Parliament
but
as a Labour candidate.
Is politics about picking out particular candidates? And, you might have your favourite obnoxious candidate and your favourite lovely candidate that you really support. But politics is about power. And so if George Galloway wins, and maybe he'd be the only one that's going to win as far as I can see. I mean, Monty Panesar woke up screaming the morning after he said he was going to stand in Southall. I don't know if any of his family and friends and relatives phoned him up and said, "What are you doing?" He realised he didn't know anything about politics the next morning. So if that's what George Galloway's got to do to get 600 candidates, he's in a bit of a parlour state. But I'm only interested in the exercise of power on behalf of working class people. And all this kind of, let's have an independent there and let's form a little faction over here and stand. And somehow that's going to do something about the situation in Gaza or the long-term issues in the Middle East or about housing or about deprivation in Britain is a fallacy. It's self-generated fantasy to say that, Tusk or the Workers' Party or any of these groups are going to have an effect on the history of Britain is a nonsense. It's just not going to happen. When the Labour Party collapsed after the MacDonald era, Ramsay MacDonald, what had to happen was the reconstruction of the Labour Party. And in many ways, they had to see off the rise of the Communist Party, right? That's just what had to happen. And if they hadn't done that, by the time 1945 came along, if Attlee hadn't been in charge with a consensus about what they're going to do, a bold programme from the centre-right of the Labour Party, we would not have got the welfare state. We would have got a Conservative government because we'd have had a fractured left. So I think it's all rubbish, this idea that one person or a cluster of people in particular seats basing their appeal on a particular moment and a particular issue or a particular culture or religion is going to be the future for working people and is going to unite the entire working class. It's not the way forward for me.
I want to move on to your experiences in the trade union movement. You were blacklisted as a construction worker in the 90s. Just from a personal perspective, an emotional perspective, what was that like? Because it was never officially recognised that blacklisting went on until many, many years later. Did you feel like gaslit at any point?
Yeah, I never know what gaslit means. People keep using it. I don't even know what that is. So,
I guess someone pissing on your leg and telling you it's raining.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't feel gaslit. I felt blacklisted. So you know what blacklisting is if you can't get a job and you know that you're a qualified person. So everybody knew the blacklist existed. It was around from 1919, the Economic League. And the McWhirter brothers, they used to do the Guinness Book of Records, some of the most right-wing people in political life in Britain. Used to run a thing called the Economic League. You can look it up later. And that came from the Red Clydeside and the uprising of working people after the First World War. And they kept it going until Thatcher. And when Thatcher emasculated the unions, for want of a better term, they thought, well, we don't need to do this anymore because we've dealt with the trades unions. But the construction, and it used to be in engineering, it was probably in education, it was probably in journalism, I don't know. But they were more interested in traditional powerhouses of the economy. They kept it going. They called it the Consulting Association. So there was a fella in a shop in the West Midlands, in a shop front, with Rolodexes. You remember Rolodexes, any of you young kids? They were things where you had all your contacts on. Before the Filofax.
I've seen them in films.
Yeah, before the Filofax and before the telephone, the modern telephone, you had Rolodexes. And they weren't covered by the first Data Protection Act because they were handwritten, hand-typed records. And he had thousands of them, thousands of workers' names. So you knew that was happening, and you knew... I mean, I got thrown off a site after I'd had a start there, after 4 or 5 weeks, and they said, we've taken out your references. And what they meant was they'd finally got the input from the Consulting Association. And they, in the end, after the court cases, they sent me these things, and they were hand-typed Rolodex cards. So your name would be on a little tab at the top, and they'd go along and find all the Lynches. So they sent me a thing saying, called Mick Lynch, could be Mike Lynch or Michael Lynch, but we couldn't find the other records. But there were people that were far more blacklisted than me. It's people that never got compensation, that people died, being thrown out of their industry, people that got very scant work over decades. I knew it was happening, and I had an opportunity to go onto the railway in '93 because I was an engineering electrician as well. So I went on the railway and worked on the high-speed trains, and that gave me a way out. But my wife said to me, "You've got to try and be quiet about the union for a period." And now I'm the General Secretary. So
You took that advice
I
to
don't know
heart.
what happened. Yeah, well, they call it the gift of the gab in Ireland. So when you kiss the Blarney Stone, you get the gift of the gab. I used to say, and I think a bit came off.
You think if it came off? I mean, how does it make you feel? Does it make you feel angry and betrayed, or does it give you a sense of purpose when you reflect
I
on
think
that experience?
if I'd suffered from it longer, it probably would make you very disillusioned. But I went into the railway and joined the RMT, and where I was, they weren't going to recognise the union, so I saw that as a challenge. So I got on with that, really. But there were other people that, I mean, I didn't take part in the campaigning that went on the Blacklist support group in any way. I was just too busy doing other things in a new industry, if you like, that I was in. But they're disappointed. Some of the people who are leading campaigners didn't get compensated or didn't get compensated properly because they'd destroyed the records. They'd literally ripped them up and threw them away. So even if they were campaigning, they never got the full compensation. And the compensation was fairly paltry. And it was a risk. They had to take a settlement rather than risk a big court case. It was a bit like the post office scandal now, that they were offered a deal and it would have cost them £5 million to go into court, which they'd have had to fundraise. And the offers would have been at risk. So the decision was to take them. But you'd probably be fairly bitter about that.
I want to talk a bit about young people and trade unions. Trade union participation.
Yeah, I think we should talk about new people rather than young people. I've got a reason for that.
New people. All right, newer members. But I suppose the reason why I say young people is because when I was in my early 20s, that's when I most needed a trade union. So I was working as a barmaid on what was basically 0 hours. And while it was a perfectly nice pub, it was like, better than a lot of pubs. You still had those problems of sexual harassment from customers and from other staff. You had problems with, so my boss kept trying to introduce like racist tea sets, like literally had like gollies printed on them, and I kept saying like, I'm not gonna serve tea out of this. What are you doing? It's just all these problems.
Well, that's a bit extreme even in a pub, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
You've been quite unlucky with that one.
I mean, her husband brought like this massive painting of like black children holding watermelons up to their mouths, and I was like, this is crazy. You can't hang this here. Long story short, when I most needed to be part of a union, I didn't even know that I could join one. I just assumed that it wasn't for professions like bartending. I wouldn't have known how to even begin organising my workplace, even if I joined one. Is the trade union movement as a whole doing enough to reach out to young people or people who are in more precarious forms of employment, 0 hours contracts or in the gig economy? Are they doing enough to recruit those people?
They do a lot, but it's not been effective. And my union has got the same problems, casualisation, as we call it, and 0 hours, outsourcing and subcontracting. All of that makes massive problems. So until 93, the RMT used to organise all the railway hotels in Britain. So if you go to some of the best hotels all around the place, at Paddington Station, at Marylebone, all those fancy hotels used to be completely unionised. And they were owned by the railway, and all the staff in them would have been in our union. And now nobody's in the union. We've got about 50 hotel worker members. Other hotels and hospitality sectors, it's now called, were organised by others. Never completely, because it's always been a difficult area. But the legislation that we've got makes it really difficult for unions to organise those workers. So that's why we need this new deal, and we need the ability to bargain on a sector-wise basis for hospitality. So until Thatcher, all these people doing fruit picking that you see that have come from Eastern Europe are now coming from further afield. There's people coming from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and all sorts of places because people can't come from Eastern Europe now. They were covered by the Agricultural Workers Agreement. The docks were covered. Most sectors were covered by collective bargaining. And you could have had access to a union. The union you could have been in was the Transport and General or USD or the Shop Workers Union. And that is still possible theoretically, but they can't do a lot for you because often people are working for agencies or got a contract that doesn't even give them any tenure at a place. And so part of the New Deal for workers is we need a legislative framework that enables the unions to operate in. And then we've got to take that opportunity. So the next 5 years, when Labour get in, is an opportunity. That's why we've got to push them as hard as we can to get this thing sector-wide bargaining. So one of the most important areas is care workers that everyone's talking about. So care workers are often shunted from pillar to post. They go and see an elderly person, they get 10 or 15 minutes, they've got to drive to the next appointment, they're checked up on constantly, they can't spend any time talking or looking at that person or monitoring them. We've got to change that model entirely so it's a respected profession, or at least a respected skill and trade, and that they get a proper set of terms and conditions. And that goes right across. Being a waiter, or in this country, or being a proper bar staff, some people want to make that their profession, should be a respected profession with qualifications, with terms and conditions, with minimum standards. So that's what we should be aiming for, and that's what the unions should be exploiting the opportunity to get under this next Labour government, which hopefully will be in for at least 10 years, at least 2 terms, so we can change all that going forward. So if you're in that type of job, you can't get a reference to even rent a property. It's very difficult because you're in that situation to get a deposit for rent or for, there's no dream of actually buying a property in a job like that. So these things all feed into each other, and the unions have got to be at the heart of that. And this government has got to bring in the strongest reforms possible in the workplace so that union organisation can exist there, and union organisation then can affect in real life what you're in, the position you're in, what that's like for those people.
So in your mind, it goes, change the legislation, unions can deliver tangible results on a sector-wide basis, and then younger people, newer workers are going to come in.
Yeah, well, younger people can join, but
where
it would be particularly effective. So in the railway, we've got very high density of membership. So in my sector, on the railway, young people will join the union because they're made to, if you like. Peer pressure is the posh term.
Cajoled.
But when you go into a workplace, if you go into work in catering, so the similar job on the railway would be catering on trains. Now that would be very, very easily go down the same way as bar work in hospitality. It hasn't. It's still completely unionised. Those people get premium times, they get agreed salaries, they get a final salary pension, they get sick pay, they get enhanced holidays and all that. If you work serving food or running a bar on railway, on a train. So that's what we need, because we've got the collective agreements that are industry-wide that cover that. So we need that in all the other sectors that have been casualised and outsourced and made precarious. But that does need legislation to allow the unions to operate in those sectors.
I suppose I've got
and then we'll get them. But they can join now if they wish to be active. But I'm not going to promise if you join the union, it's going to solve all your problems. We've seen this stuff with Amazon, how hard a nut to crack that is in Britain. But it is getting underway in America with the Starbucks union. I mean, the only economy in Britain now is selling each other coffee and painting nails, it seems to me, and tattoos is the way we're going to spend our time. So we need to sort out how we're going to organise those bits of the economy, because they're very large parts of the economy and a lot of people are working in them.
So I suppose my last question is a big one, and it's inequality is growing. Housing affordability is at its worst level since like 1875. Like, it's really crazy. We're starting to see the impact of climate change on food prices. That's something which is only going to get worse. But it feels like socialist change is further away than ever. What's something that you think...
It's going to get elected in 3 weeks, isn't it?
Well, Keir
Depends
Starmer...
what you mean by socialist change, though.
Yeah.
So Keir Starmer called himself... I'm not praising Keir Starmer, but...
Do you believe him when he says he's a socialist?
I believe he thinks he's a socialist, yeah. So each to their own lights. But I don't believe that, many of the left, the ideological left, think that Lenin was a socialist. I think that Stalin was some form of socialist. I don't think they were at all. I think they took the movement in completely the wrong direction. I'm always had no time for those people. They ended up as a prison house of the working class, if you like. So who's going to upset a lot of your listeners?
You know what? I was rereading Lenin recently, so I'm just interested in listening to you.
Well, you want to read Martov, not Lenin. He's
okay,
the one that
all right.
has the answers. So, and all the great reformers. So socialist change is going to happen through the gradual reform of our society, and you can't have socialism without socialists. So we must make socialists in the working class community through continual education, through continual activity, not just holding up a signpost and saying socialism's over there to your left. And if you just go over there somehow, it's going to happen. Because if the Corbyn government had been elected, it would have been beset by massive crises, some of them created by the ruling class. The Starmer government's going to have enough problems. If you look at what's coming out of the Telegraph in the last 2 weeks, some Tory minister said to me the other day, I believe in a socialist single-party state. And he said, that's what you're going to get under Starmer. They're going rabid about Starmer. So we've got to prepare the fact that we need a mass working-class socialist movement, which is going to be centred around the Labour Party and the trade unions. People have got to get used to that. And you've got to win the battle of ideas in that movement, not to the left of it, or as some kind of appendage to it that's throwing stones in the direction of people like Starmer. They've got to be put under pressure as social democrats, by social democrats. And I mean that in the broader sense. Lenin, of course, was a member of the Social Democratic Party at one stage. So that's where the work's got to be done. And just saying socialism is a thing, it can't be a thing that is separate to working people. It's got to be of the working people, and it's got to be desired and created by working people by putting people who are bolder than Starmer in the next iteration of a Labour government into power and wielding that power on behalf of the ideas that we want to see delivered.
And if he doesn't, if he sacks Angela Rayner,
then we're going to have a big problem. We'll be really angry about that as a trade union. I'll be talking to all the TUC general secretaries about how the working class movement's going to respond. Because what I keep saying to them, there's only 11 unions affiliated to Labour now, out of 42 or 43 or something. There are more unions not affiliated than affiliated, but we still want them to deliver on behalf of our movement. So if Angela Rayner's not got a prominent role, is not delivering the New Deal for workers, the TUC and the Labour unions are going to have to do something about that, and that means getting on the front foot. And it may mean that we have to test the limits of the relationship between the unions and the Labour Party, and test the limits of where the anti-trade union laws are going to be and all of that. I'm up for that. But we can't then say, oh, we're going to create a separate thing. It has to be one thing. There's no room for more than one labour movement in Britain. And the labour movement's got to be it all, from the co-op to the artists and the media people, to the trade unions, to the working class communities, to the politicians that we put there on our behalf.
Mick Lynch, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.